All right, let's get into Daenerys II, A Game of Thrones. Daenerys II is the first chapter that we're going to come to that George wrote after his break. George begins writing A Game of Thrones in 91. He writes about 14 chapters. He then takes a break to pursue a pilot called Doorways that did not get picked up, and then he comes back to writing in about 93. He finishes the whole Daenerys story before the rest of A Game of Thrones, so he's very focused on Daenerys after the break. But if you notice, he's more focused on the Stark plot and the War of the Five Kings before. I mean, we have the one Daenerys story, but we there's still much more focus on what's going on in Westeros versus Essos, and then after his break, he gets kind of very into Daenerys, and we're gonna see a lot. He was toying around with Daenerys and what her story is like, and we can see some remnants of what was before. Anyway, I'll get into it here. Daenerys wed Khal Drogo with fear and barbaric splendor in a field beyond the walls of Pentos. For the Dothraki believed that all things of importance in a man's life must be done beneath the open sky. Now here we're obviously like George R. R. Martin is trying to evoke the idea of barbarians at the gate. And clearly he has the walls of Pentos. He has barbaric splendor, barbaric. He's trying to give that impression that like this is Rome, and over there are the Germanic tribes, or it's Attila the Hun. It's he's getting that idea of others. And of course, this is being paralleled to Westeros, where we have the wall and the others on the other side. So, in a sense, the Dothraki are like this horde of others, coming in. But it's not that simple, at least in this chapter. George R. R. Martin, in this chapter, paints a very complicated situation with the Dothraki that I kind of feel is largely abandoned, which is too bad. But anyway, we'll continue on. Drogo called his Khalasar to attend him, and they had come. 40,000 Dothraki warriors and uncounted numbers of women, children, and slaves. Outside the city walls, they camped with their vast herds, raising palaces of woven grass, eating everything in sight, and making the good folk of Pentos more anxious with every passing day. This is the idea that they're just this devastating mass of, this devastating horde. There's this fear of these savages, and like I say, they're just eating everything in sight, like as if like the others and their whites would just destroy and consume everything in sight, like locusts. Now, what's interesting here is Drogo called his Khalasar. So Drogo was chilling at his manse in Pentos, and then everybody came to him. And that's really quite fascinating. And like I say, I think it's an idea that's largely dropped, but it's more accurate to history. So this idea of barbarians at the gate, savages bringing down Rome, that those kind of pushed during the Renaissance era, is largely false. Like the Germanic tribes were more like Germanic kingdoms who had in many ways assimilated to very Roman-like lifestyles. If you go into a museum in Scandinavia, you will see that these Germanic savages, Teutonic savages, were producing things, were producing art, weaponry, agriculture that was very, very similar to what the Romans were doing. They had largely assimilated the Roman way of life, and so this notion of savages coming in and destroying Rome is off. It's very off. And so the idea here is that Drogo is fully aware of like what Free City's life is like, and enjoys Free City life. I mean, he has a manse, but but you know, the politics is politics, and whatever. There's different wars, but this idea that Drogo is not a savage, and he was never intended to be a savage, though, like I say, George somewhat goes away from this idea. But I mean, it's understandable here in the beginning when Daenerys is a child and doesn't understand what's going on. But you know, getting to Dothraki and seeing how things occur in that city, I don't know, and her relationship with Drogo just seems to be a little weird. But we'll get into it. My fellow magisters have doubled the size of the city guard, Illyrio told them over platters of honey duck and orange snap peppers one night at the manse that had been Drogo's. Okay, so again, Drogo's manse. Drogo is well familiar with living it up and the free city's lifestyle. The Cal had joined his Khalasar, his estate given over to Daenerys and her brother until the wedding. The timeline here is kind of weird because it's like Daenerys wed Khal Drogo, but then the wedding hasn't really happened yet. I mean, George does some weird stuff by throwing in had and then going into present tense, but you know, George clearly wanted this sentence up front, even though they're not wedded yet. Best we get Princess Daenerys wedded quickly before they hand half the wealth of Pentos away to sellswords and bravos. Sir Jorah Mormont jested. Jorah doesn't really make that many jokes after this. He's not that funny of a guy. The exile had offered her brother his sword. The exile had offered her brother his sword that night. The night Dany had been sold to Khal Drogo, Viserys accepted eagerly. Mormont had been their constant companion ever since. Mormont had sworn an oath to Viserys. And this is one of the reasons people are like, why do you hate Mormont so much? Because you compare, say, how Brienne acts when she swears her sword to Catelyn, and you compare it to the way Mormont acts towards Viserys when he swears his sword to Viserys, and there's a big difference between those two kind of characters. Magister Illyrio laughed lightly through his forked beard, but Viserys did not so much as smile. He can have her tomorrow if he likes, her brother said. He glanced over at Dany, and she lowered her eyes. So long as he pays the price. Now, this scene is kind of interesting because remember that in A Dance with Dragons, Illyrio claims that Viserys is lusting after Daenerys and wants to take her maidenhead before the wedding, though we don't really get any inkling of that in this scene. So fans discuss whether or not Illyrio is lying or whether he's telling the truth about Viserys' intentions. Illyrio waved a languid hair in the air, rings glittering on his fat fingers. I have told you, all this is settled. Trust me. The Khal has promised you a crown, and you shall have it. Yes, but when? When the Khal chooses, Illyrio said. We will have the girl first. Or he will have the girl first, and after they're wed, he must make his procession across the plains and present her to the Dosh Khaleen at Dothraki. After that, perhaps, if omens favor war. Viserys seethed with impatience. I piss on Dothraki omens. The usurper sits my father's throne. How long must I wait? Illyrio gave a massive shrug. You have waited most of your life, great king. What is another few months, another few years? Sir Jorah, who had traveled as far as east as Dothraki, nodded in agreement. I counsel you to be patient, your grace. The Dothraki are true to their word, but they must do things in their own time. A lesser man may beg a favor from the Khal, but must never presume to berate him. Viserys bristled. Guard your tongue, Mormont, or I'll have it out. I'm no lesser man. I'm the rightful king of the seven kingdoms. The dragon does not beg. Yeah, that was a really... I know this is played off as like Viserys being hot-headed, but that's a really brutally bad thing to say to a king, calling him a lesser man. Viserys, I'm surprised he did not want to have Mormont killed for that comment. So this is this idea we're playing with this notion that, oh, Viserys is an idiot because he doesn't know that the Dothraki give gifts, and you just have to like wait. But Khal Drogo has lived in the free cities. He knows like how things work. He's not an idiot. So this whole notion of oh, we've got to be careful of their cultural ways, like you're not sure if it's just all a bunch of bull. Like, oh no, Viserys, we can't do anything now. Well, why not? Well, Viserys is correct. Like, Khal Drogo knows how things work. They have markets in Bastoth Rock. They aren't just gifting each other everything at the markets. Like, they understand money and exchange of commerce. Like, it's ridiculous to be like, oh, they don't buy and sell things. Like, bull. Okay, it's just absolute bull. Like, it's just ridiculous idea. So Jorah lowered his eyes respectfully. Illyrio smiled enigmatically and tore a wing from his duck. Honey and grease ran over his fingers and dripped down to his beard as he nibbled at the tender meat. There are no more dragons, Dany thought, staring at her brother, though she did not say it aloud. And now keep in mind that when this chapter was originally written, and all these early chapters, George did not plan on having dragons in the story. He is later convinced by Phyllis Eisenstein to put them in. But at this point, when he first wrote this, no notion that there's going to be dragons. Yet that night she dreamt of one. Now, again, this has been edited, so maybe these dragon dreams have been put back. but I don't know. I'd have to compare like early drafts. Yet that night she dreamt of one. Viserys was hitting her, hurting her. She was naked, clumsy with fear. She ran from him, but her body seemed thick and ungainly. He struck her again. She stumbled and fell. You woke the dragon, he screamed and kicked her. You woke the dragon, you woke the dragon. Her thighs were slick with blood. Now, this is very, she closed her eyes and whimpered. So, this thighs thick with blood, we're going to get a lot about Daenerys's bloody vagina. This is going to come up a lot. Whether we're talking about the breaking of her hymen producing the blood, or menstruation, or something else, sacrifice. Having pregnancy complications. Dany's bloody vagina, it just comes back a lot, and it comes back in A Dance with Dragons. But this is this notion that Dany has a dream that Viserys is essentially raping her and taking her maidenhead. Okay, this is why she's naked, running from him. You woke the dragon. This is he's talking about his dick. He's talking about angry. He's talking about his dick. Her thighs were slick with blood, as if her hymen's been broken, even though there's not going to be that much blood, But nonetheless, this is all like what's going on in the scene. So it's interesting that Illyrio later claims that Viserys did want to do this, but he put guards at her door, and instead she just dreamed of it. She closed her eyes and whimpered. As if in answer, there was a hideous ripping sound and crackling of some great fire. When she looked again, Viserys was gone. Great columns of flames arose around her. In the midst of them was a dragon. It turns its head slowly. When its molten eyes found her, she woke, shaking and covered with fine sheets of sweat. She had never been so afraid. Until the day of her wedding came at last. So timeline, this is just, timeline wise, this is also really weird because this implies that the day of her wedding would have come maybe in a couple more days, because if she's woken up in the morning, it should be the day of her wedding, because he says that he can have her tomorrow, but maybe it's not tomorrow. So, but if it's not tomorrow, then her having the dream of Viserys taking her maidenhead did not happen at the same time that supposedly Viserys was trying to take her maidenhead. The timeline on this is very, very strange because obviously the first thing is that they wed, but then they didn't wed. In fact, days were passing, and so finally we get to the wedding. The ceremony began at dawn and continued until dusk, an endless day of drinking and feasting and fighting. A mighty earthen ramp had been raised amid the grass palaces, and there Dany was seated beside Khal Drogo above the seething sea of Dothraki. She had never seen so many people in one place, nor people so strange and frightening. The horse lords might put on rich fabrics and sweet perfumes when they visited the free cities, but out under the open sky they kept the old ways. So again, like Khal Drogo and they take vacations to the free cities and chill. I guess while they're gone, Blood Riders are in charge of the Khalasar or something. But whatever the case, like Khal Drogo, he parties it up. So he knows somewhat about free cities lifestyle. Men and women alike wore painted leather vests over bare chests and horsehair leggings cinched by bronze medallions, and warriors greased their long hairs with fat from the rendering pits. They gorged themselves on horse flesh roasted with honey and peppers, drank themselves blind on fermented hair milk and Illyrio's fine wines. I don't know where they're getting all this honey from. I guess they're trading for it. And spat jests at each other across the fires, their voices harsh and alien to Dany's ears. Viserys was seated just below her, splendid in a new black wool tunic with a scarlet dragon on the chest. Illyrio and Jorah sat beside him. Theirs was a place of high honor, just below the Khal's own blood riders, but Dany could see the anger in her brother's lilac eyes. So they essentially, like, they understand, like, they have these elevated daises and everything, and they understand all of this. He did not like sitting beneath her, and he fumed when the slaves offered her dish first to the Khal and his bride, and served him from portions they refused. He could do nothing but nurse his resentment, so nurse it he did, his mood glowing blacker at each hour at each insult to his person. Yeah, so I mean, it's funny that we kind of like give Viserys a hard time here, but you kind of imagine, like, what would Robert do? What would Aerys do? What would Robb Stark do? What would Renly do? What would Stannis do? Would any of them act better than Viserys? I don't know. Probably Robb. But I don't know about the rest. Daenerys had never felt so alone as she did seated in the midst of the vast horde. Her brother had told her to smile, so she smiled until her face ached and the tears came unbidden to her eyes. She did her best to hide them, knowing how angry Viserys would be if he saw her crying, terrified of how Khal Drogo might react. Food was brought to her, steaming joints of meat and thick black sausages and Dothraki blood pies, and later fruits and sweet grass stews and delicate pastries from the kitchens of Pentos. But she waved it all away. Her stomach was a royal, and she knew she could keep none of it down. So again, Viserys seems very, very focused just on the crown. So it's kind of, I do find it really weird that Illyrio tells this story that he wanted to take Dany's maidenhead. There was no one to talk to. This is also a really weird thing. There was no one to talk to. Khal Drogo shouted commands and jests down to his blood riders and laughed at their replies, but he scarcely glanced at Dany beside him. They had no common language. They had no common language. here's the thing. Khal Drogo, he speaks and he has relations with the free cities. So there must be someone around who speaks High Valyrian. And he spends time at his manse. He wears silks and visits the free cities. Um, and here it is. Dothraki was incomprehensible to her, and the Khal knew only a few words of bastard Valyrian of the free cities, and none of the common tongue of the Seven Kingdoms. So I guess it's just, I guess like George forgot, or at this point, that Dany knows Valyrian. She grew up in Essos. She grew up um, going from free city to free city, living in different people's houses. So she knows Valyrian. She knows Valyrian from each of the free cities. And yet they're not trying to talk in Valyrian. It even says that he knew some words of Valyrian. And yet she's not talking to him in Valyrian. Yeah. See, this is why I say like George is like playing with these ideas. Like if you compare it to the show, like it's very clear that like Khal Drogo in the show doesn't visit the cities. And he's, he doesn't have all sorts of silks in his own manse and take vacations to Pentos. And, but all of a sudden here he's, so it kind of makes more sense in the show but here, like George is like establishing the Dothraki more historically accurate here. If we're talking about comparing them to, Germanic tribes or the Huns, in that they're not unfamiliar with the West. But then it's kind of all abandoned, that they do actually become like, no, they are completely unfamiliar and just have no idea. Anyway, she would have welcomed the conversation of Illyrio and her brother, but they were too far below to hear her. So she sat in her wedding silks, nursing a cup of honeyed wine, afraid to eat, talking silently to herself. I am the blood of the dragon, she told herself. I am Daenerys Stormborn, princess of Dragonstone, and the blood and seed of Aegon the Conqueror. The sun was only a quarter way up in the sky when she saw her first man die. Drums were beating as some of the women danced for the call. Drogo watched without expression, but his eyes followed their movement. And from time to time, he would toss down a bronze medallion for the women to fight over. Now we're leaning into the savageness. That he's just, why not just have like, people beating each other to death at a wedding, and fighting over medallions. The warriors were watching too. One of them finally stepped into the circle, grabbed a dancer by the arm, and pushed her down to the ground and mounted her right there, as a stallion mounts a mare. Illyrio had told her that this might happen. Yeah, trying to be as savage as possible. They're just having sex in the open. The Dothraki mate like animals in their herds. There's no privacy in the Khalasar, and they do not understand sin or shame as we do. Dany looked away from the coupling, frightened she might realize what was happening. But a second warrior stepped forward, and a third, and soon there was no way to avert her eyes. The two men seized the same woman. She heard a shout, saw a shove, and in a blink of an eye, the Arrax were out, long razor-sharp blades, half swords, half scythes. So the Arrak, the half sword, half scythe, there's no real historical precedent for this. Like, I understand that there are other, like, scimitars or whatever that people had historically, but the blade is on the other side. So it's kind of weird. Yeah, like Anyway, there's a lot of people discuss like the Eric and what a weird um, weapon it is. But a dance of death began, and as the warriors circled and slashed, leaping towards each other, whirling the blades around their heads, shrieking insults at at each clash. No one made a move to interfere. Yeah, so I mean, maybe I hope this was intentional from George, but we start in Daenerys 1 and Daenerys 2 that at the beginning of Daenerys 2 that Khal Drogo is perhaps familiar with um the free city society, but then it's revealed slowly, the onion is revealed that no, actually they're just more and more savage, more and more savage. You know, which is usually the reverse in life. Usually you come across a culture and you assume that they're savage because they're so foreign. But then as the onion gets peeled, you realize that they're not. But here he's gone the other way. It ended as quickly as it began. The Erics shivered together faster than Dany could follow. One man missed a step and the other swung his blade in a flat arc. Steel bit into flesh just above the Dothraki's waist and opened him from backbone to belly button, spilling his entrails into the dust. As the loser died, the winner took hold of the nearest woman, not even the one they had been quarreling over, and had her there and then. The slave carried off the body, and the dancing resumed. Magister Illyrio had warned Dany about this. A Dothraki wedding without at least 3 deaths is deemed a dull affair, he had said. Her wedding must have been especially blessed. Before our day was over, a dozen men had died. I don't know mathematically how this can... I mean, maybe weddings are rare. Maybe people don't get wed very much. The idea is like if everybody wed and then would have children, like you can't have more people dying than people, having weddings, unless it's all young single men, boys, or maybe people just don't get wed very often. As the hours passed, the terror grew in Dany until it was all she could do to scream. She was afraid of the Dothraki, whose ways seemed alien and monstrous, as if they were beasts in human skin and not true men at all. She was afraid of her brother, of what he might do if he failed him. I think, by the way, this battle over women, I think this is George saying this is sort of a duel over a woman's affection, right? That in the same sense that like Brandon and Littlefinger had a duel over a woman's affection, that this is the same thing essentially, or that it's simply a different culture doing it. But something that was seen so honorable, the 2 men dueling over a woman's affection over someone's hand. But here the same thing is happening, but it's savage. Just to show that the civilized society is also savage when most of all she was afraid what might happen under the stars when her brother gave her up to the hulking giant who sat drinking beside her with a face as still and cruel as a bronze mask. I am the blood of the dragon, she told herself again. When at last the sun was low in the sky, Khal Drogo clapped his hands together, and the drums and the shouting and feasts came to a sudden halt. Drogo stood and pulled Dany to her feet beside him. It was time for her bride gifts. And after the gifts, she knew, after the sun was gone down, it would be time for the first ride and the consummation of her marriage. Dany tried to put the thought aside. It would not leave her. She hugged herself to try to keep her from shaking. Her brother Viserys gifted her 3 handmaids. Dany knew that this cost him nothing. Illyrio no doubt provided the girls. Iri and Jikwi were copper-skinned Dothraki with black hair and almond-shaped eyes. Daria, a fair-skinned, blue-eyed Lyseni girl. These are no common servants, sweet sister, her brother told her as they were brought forward one by one. Illyrio and I selected them personally for you. Iri will teach you riding, Jikwi the Dothraki tongue, and Daria will instruct you in the womanly arts of love. He smiled thinly. She's very good, Illyrio, and I both can swear to that. So here Illyrio has selected Iri, Jikwi, and Daria. This is his idea that any one of them could actually be an Illyrio spy, and I think there's some suspicion about Daria, but based on Daria's actions later on. I don't know if there's too much to glean about Iri and Jikwi. Maybe later on, but Daria definitely some shady, suspicious things about Daria. And here it's strange that like Viserys, again, this idea, was Viserys really in love with Daenerys? And here he's talking about how like, oh, it's really great that like you're going to get this sex instructor so you can please Khal Drogo. You know, it's not really an action somebody does for someone they're in love with, you know. It's always my trouble with that beginning of A Dance with Dragons. Sir Jorah Mormont apologized for his gift. It's a small thing, my princess, but all a poor exile could afford. He said as he laid a small stack of books before her. They were histories and songs of the 7 kingdoms she saw written in the common tongue. She thanked him with all her heart. And these books are never seen again. You'd think they would come back, you know, that there was something interesting in there. Never mentioned again. Illyrio murmured a command, and 4 burly slaves hurried forward, bearing between a great cedar chest bound in bronze. When she opened it, she found piles of the finest velvets and damasks and masks the free cities could produce. And this is where we get a little change. In the original Daenerys II, there were no dragon eggs because there were no dragons. Dragons were not going to be part of the story. And then later on, at some point, George does decide that dragons are going to be part of it. And Daenerys finds the eggs outside of Dothraki. And then he decided that was no good, and he cut that portion and put the eggs into the wedding. So these eggs, so a lot of people puzzle at like what is Illyrio doing when you can buy so much with dragon eggs and such like this, and they're so expensive, and Viserys could buy an army and things like this. What's Illyrio's plan? Well, whatever George is doing, he decided it kind of late. He had other stuff that he was going to do first. He was going to have no dragons. He was going to have her find those eggs outside of Dothraki, and then he put him here. So, I mean, in the sense of like George having a master plan about what Illyrio was doing with those eggs and why he gave them to Daenerys, which is a question he himself brings up in A Dance with Dragons at the end. You know, he was having rapidly changing ideas. Resting on top, nestled in a soft cloth, were 3 huge eggs. Dany gasped. They're the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. Each was different from the other, patterned in such rich colors that at first she thought they were crusted in jewels, and so large that it took both of her hands to hold one. She lifted it delicately, expecting that it would be made of some fine porcelain, a delicate enamel, or even blown glass, but it was much heavier than that, as if they were solid stone. The surface of the shell was covered with tiny scales, and as she turned the egg between her fingers, they shimmered like polished metal in the light of the setting sun. One egg was deep green, with burnished bronze flecks that came and went, depending on how Dany turned it. Another was pale cream streaked with gold. The last was black as a midnight sea, yet alive with scarlet ripples and swirls. What are they? She asked, her voice hushed and full of wonder. Dragon eggs from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai. Now, of course, this has been. I mean, maybe Magister Illyrio doesn't know, but we kind of know that these eggs have been have been retconned, um, and we kind of with Fire and Blood that they're probably eggs from Dreamfire, and at some point they're get into the hands of Illyrio, but they don't seem to be from Ashai. But I don't know if we even hear about Ashai having a history with dragons. The eons have turned them to stone, yet still they burn bright with beauty. That's another kind of weird thing. The eons have turned them to stone. I guess he just doesn't know. He just doesn't know that what eggs feel like or whatever. He doesn't know. But, maybe at the time when this was written, they were from Ashai or something. I don't know. I shall treasure them always. Dany had heard tales of such eggs, but she had never seen one, nor thought to see one. It was a truly magnificent gift, though she knew that Illyrio could afford to be lavish. He had collected a fortune in horses and slaves for his part in selling her to Khal Drogo. Still, these dragon eggs are supposedly enough to buy an army. The Khal's blood riders offered her 3 weapons, and splendid weapons they were. Hago gave her a great leather whip with a silver handle. Koholo, a magnificent arak, chased in gold. And Kotho, a double-curved dragon-bone bow taller than she was. Magister Illyrio and Ser Jorah had taught her in the traditional refusals for such offerings. This is a gift worthy of a great warrior, O blood of my blood, and I am but a woman. Let my lord husband bear these in my stead. And so Khal Drogo too received his bride gifts. I think this is a bit of, obviously George is focusing on like the role of women being subservient and it being a statement on, that they're not supposed to be fighting and all of this. I think it's also kind of this idea about like when we hear about, women getting dowers as opposed to so dowry is when you pay someone to take a daughter, but a dower is when the woman is paid in order to by the family to have a sort of amount of wealth that in case something happens to the husband she can survive on, right? But many people kind of chuckle at this idea because it's like, does the wife really have access to that? Oftentimes, yes, she does. But it depends on the society and the time. But sometimes it's like you're giving all this money to the woman, but it's really going to the man. Other gifts she was given in plenty by other Dothraki: slippers and jewels and silver rings for her hair, medallions, belts, painted vests, soft furs, sand silks, jars of scent, needles and feathers, and tiny bottles of purple glass, a gown made from the skin of 1,000 mice. That gown should come back. A handsome gift, Khaleesi, Magister Illyrio had said at last, after he had told her what it was. Most lucky. The gifts mounted up around her in a great pile, the more gifts than she could possibly imagine, more gifts than she could want or use. And last of all, Khal Drogo brought forth his own bride gift to her. An expected hush rippled out through the center of the camp and left her side, growing until it had swallowed the whole Khalasar. And when he returned, the dense press of Dothraki gift givers parted before him, and he led a horse to her. She was a young filly, spirited and splendid. Dany knew just enough about horses to know that she was no ordinary animal. There was something about her that took her breath away. She was gray as the winter sea, with a mane like silver smoke. Hesitantly, she reached out to stroke the horse's neck, ran her fingers through the silver of her mane. Khal Drogo said something in Dothraki, and Magister Illyrio translated, "Silver for your silver hair," the Khal says. "She's beautiful," Dany murmured. "She is the pride of the Khalasar," Illyrio said. "Custom decrees that the Khaleesi must ride a mount worthy of her place by the side of the Khal." So, and here we're getting, now obviously Silver stays in our story for a long time. The horse is still being ridden as we speak by Barristan Selmy as he goes into battle. But we're getting a little bit of an introduction of perhaps women have more power than, or at least the Khaleesi has more power than people think. Because here she is riding by the Khal's side, which is, and that her mount must be worthy. So even though we just established that worthy warriors can't have all this stuff, and women aren't warriors, there's something else here. There's, is being said that perhaps she is going to have more power than she thought and that anybody else thinks. Drogo stepped forward and put his hands on her waist. He lifted her up easily as if she were a child and set her up on the thin Dothraki saddle. "She is a child." As if she were a child. She's a child. So much smaller than the ones she was used to. Dany sat there uncertain for a moment. No one had told her about this part. "What should I do?" she asked Illyrio. It was Ser Jorah Mormont who answered, "Take the reins and ride. You need not go far." Nervously, Dany gathered the reins in her hand and slid her feet into the short stirrups. She was only a fair rider. She had spent more time traveling by ship and wagon and palanquin than by horseback. Praying that she would not fall off and disgrace herself, she gave the filly the lightest and most timid touch with her knees. And for the first time in hours, she forgot to be afraid. And this is a kind of weird magical moment, supernatural in nature. Or perhaps for the first time ever, the silver gray filly moved with a smooth and silken gait, and the crowd parted for her, every eye upon her. Dany found herself moving faster than she had intended, yet somehow it was exciting rather than terrifying. The horse broke into a trot, and she smiled. Dothraki scrambled to clear a path. The slightest pressure with her legs and the lightest touch on the reins, and the filly responded. She sent it into a gallop. And now the Dothraki were hooting and laughing and shouting as they jumped out of her way. As she turned to ride back, a fire pit loomed ahead, directly in her path. They were hemmed in on either side, with no room to stop. A daring she had never known filled Daenerys, and she gave the filly her head. The silver horse leapt to the flames as if she had wings. Ridiculous. Ridiculous that someone that is self-professed not that good with horses, only fair with them, would suddenly be taking her horse and having it jump over a pit of fire. Ridiculous. But this is a magical moment. She's suddenly confident. So maybe Quaithe is in her head doing something, making her confident. Because she also acts very confident, strangely, later here. When she pulled up before Magister Illyrio, she said, "Tell Khal Drogo that he has given me the wind." The fat Pantashi stroked his yellow beard, and he repeated her words in Dothraki, and Dany saw her new husband smile for the first time. The last sliver of sun vanished behind the high walls of Pentos to the west. Just then, Dany had lost all track of time. Khal Drogo, people losing track of time, common thing, and Khal Drogo commanded his blood riders to bring forth his own horse, a lean red stallion. As the Khal was saddling the horse, Viserys slid close to Dany on her silver, dug his fingers into her legs, and said, "Please him, sweet sister, or I swear you will see the dragon wake as it has never woken before." The fear came back to her then, with her brother's words. She felt like a child once more, only 13 and all alone. not ready for what was about to happen to her. And so this idea is that, like, you know, Viserys is this world of fear, and now she's entering this world of liberation. Or at least she feels it's going to be a world of liberation with Khal Drogo. She's got some sort of like hope in her. They rode out together as the stars came out, leaving the Khalasar and the Grass Palace behind. This idea of her riding out under stars, this is later a vision at the House of the Undying. Khal Drogo spoke no words to her, but drove his stallion into at a hard trot through the gathering dusk. Tiny silver bells in his long braid rang softly as he rode. "I'm the blood of the dragon," she whispered aloud as she followed, trying to keep up her courage. "I'm the blood of the dragon. I'm the blood of the dragon." The dragon was never afraid. Afterwards, she could not say how far or how long they had ridden, but it was full dark when they stopped at a grassy place beside a small stream. Drogo swung off his horse and lifted her down from hers. She felt as fragile as glass in his hands, her limbs as weak as water. She stood there helpless and trembling in her wedding silks while he secured the horses, and when he turned to her, she began to cry. Khal Drogo stared at her tears, his face strangely empty of expression. "No," he said. He lifted his hand and rubbed away her tears roughly with his calloused thumbs. George loves talking about calloused hands. "You speak the common tongue?" Dany said in wonder. "No," he said again. "You both speak Valyrian." You both speak Valyrian. Perhaps he had only that word, she thought. But it was one word more than she had known he had, and somehow it made her feel a little better. Drogo touched her hair lightly, sliding the silver strands between his fingers and murmuring softly in Dothraki. Dany did not understand the words, yet there was warmth in the tone, a tenderness she had not expected from the man. He put his fingers under her chin and lifted her head, and so she was looking up into his eyes. Even though it's completely dark, I guess the stars are bright enough. Drogo towered over her as he towered over everyone. Taking her lightly under the arms, he lifted her and seated her on the rounded rock beside the stream. Then he sat on the ground facing her, legs crossed beneath him, their faces finally at a height. "No," he said. "Is that the only word you know?" she asked him. Drogo did not reply. "You both speak Valyrian." Drogo did not reply. His heavy braid was coiled in dirt beside him. He pulled it over his right shoulder and began to remove the bells from his hair one by one. After a moment, Dany leaned forward to help. When they were done, Drogo gestured. She understood. Slowly, carefully, she began to undo his braid. It took a long time. After the while, he sat there silently watching her. When they were done, he shook his head, and his hair spread out behind them like a river of darkness, oiled and gleaming. She had never seen hair so long, so black, so thick. Then it was his turn. He began to undress her. His fingers were deft and strangely tender. He removed her silks one by one carefully, while Dany sat unmoving, silent, looking at his eyes. When he bared her small breasts, she could not help herself. She averted her eyes and covered herself with hands. "No," Drogo said. He pulled his hands away from her breasts, gently but firmly, then lifted her face again to make him look up at him. "No," he repeated. "No," she echoed back at him. Of course, later on, so here they're having this tender romance sex, which later they stop having. So it's very odd that we have this very kind of memorable scene that's eventually taken away later. The show decided to, kind of go a different path. "No," she echoed back at him. He stood up then and pulled her close and removed the last of her silks. The night air was chilly on her bare skin. She shivered. The goose flesh covered her arms and legs. She was afraid of what would come next, but for a while nothing happened. Khal Drogo sat with his legs crossed, looking at her, drinking in her body with his eyes. After a while he began to touch her, lightly at first, then harder. Then she could sense the fierce strength of his hands, but he never hurt her. He held her hand in his own and brushed her fingers one by one. He ran a hand gently down her legs, He stroked her face, tracing the curves of her ears, running a finger gently around her mouth. He put both hands in her hair and combed it with his fingers. He turned her around, massaged her shoulders, slid a knuckle down the path of her spine. It seemed as if hours passed before his hands finally went to her breasts. He stroked the soft skin underneath until it tingled. He circled her nipples with his thumbs, pinched them between the thumb and forefingers, then began to pull away, very lightly at first, then more insistently until her nipples stiffened and began to ache. An unusual paragraph here. This is very not George, where everything starts with he. Everything starts with he. Everything starts with he. I mean, he's trying to have this be very, I guess like simple like Dany because she's a child, direct and so that you know exactly what's going on. But it's strange. There's like, I've never seen a paragraph of George R. R. Martin where every single sentence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 begin with he, but he stopped them and drew her down onto his lap. Dany was flushed and breathless, her heart flooding her chest. He cupped her face with his huge hands and looked into her eyes. No, he said, and she knew it. And she knew it was a question. She took his hands and moved it down to the wetness between her thighs. Yes, she whispered, as she put his fingers inside her. And so yeah, this is apparently George felt it very important to have like Khal Drogo be gentle and wanting consensual sex with Dany. At least I guess in Dany's head, she's perhaps like creating this. But she's also a child, and when this was originally written, she was even a year younger. She was aged up a year in edits. So she's like 13 years old, and in the original, she's 12. And so it's a weird scene. I think it's supposed to make us feel uncomfortable. It's supposed to make us feel like, because it's making it sound like this is some sort of like thing that she wants that's consensual and nice and all of this. And Dany definitely thinks of it as this later on, but there's nothing, like, objectively speaking, there's nothing nice about this. She was just sold as a 13-year-old girl to some dude, and she should be scared, and she was scared, but all of a sudden she wasn't. Just like she wasn't scared with the horse, now she's weirdly not scared with Drogo, which gives this element that something supernatural is going on. Anyway, that's Daenerys. Daenerys II is what one of the first chapters that George writes when he comes back from his big break. And that's all. We'll continue on next time. All right. Thanks. Bye.